Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. Mr. Shaw
Miss Willbrand.
here coming at you about Learning Objective 1.2. Today we're going to talk about immigration, and we're going to try to keep it under 30 minutes.
We're going to explain the difficulties that different groups face during the Gilded Age.
Let's do it. Oh, man. Oops.
Don't
no,
show
I'm
all our
embarrassed.
secrets.
I'm embarrassed. You want to go first?
You go.
Okay, so let's talk about Through the Golden Door. What you need to know in the next slide, we're going to talk about a lot of the problems that were happening in Europe. America, especially during the Industrial Age, was really seen as like the place to be. People really wanted to go there. There was a land of opportunity. There was a lot of land. There was a lot of jobs. So from 1870 to 1920, approximately 20 million Europeans immigrated to America. And it was increasingly from Southern and Eastern Europe. Previous immigrants, like the people that founded the country, were from Northern and Western Europe. So now we're talking about more Germans and more Italians, things like that. And they have different cultures and all kinds of stuff. So I'm sure it'll all go great. Anyway, you need to know two things about immigrants. They have push factors and pull factors. So push factors, these are things that are pushing them out of their current country. These are like negative conditions which repel individuals. They make them want to leave. And then pull factors are things from the new country that are pulling them, that are attracting them.
They're appealing.
They're appealing. They're like, again, to the new country. So like, for example, like my wife is from Peru. So they had like a push factor during, like when her family immigrated here, was terrorism. And it was really kind of unsafe to live in Peru during that time. A pull factor for for America would have been the jobs or the ability to go to a better college or things like that. Quote unquote, the American dream. I love it.
All right. So many people do leave, specifically Europe in this part, for religious persecution. You know this from colonization. This has been going on for years. It doesn't stop with just your Puritans and your Pilgrims. It's going to continue throughout the world. People are going to constantly be persecuted for their religious preferences or the things that they believe in, and pushed out of their country and pulled into a land, America, where they can practice freedom of religion. Thank you, First Amendment, right? European population boom. The population in Europe is going to expand rapidly. We are not the only country going through industrialization. Europe hits that just before we do, and they have mass industry. With that, they have really crowded cities. They're going to see all the problems that we see with industrialization, unsafe conditions, overcrowding, just dirty, nasty cities, disease. And with that, you're going to see less land. Less land means less farming. Less farming means less food. So food's going to be expensive. So they're going to leave. That's a push factor to leave, to come to a place where they can have their own land, pull factor, and start a better life where they can have more opportunities and more things. Again, industrialization. There are more jobs here in America because those jobs are kind of all spoken for in Europe. There are going to be more reforms and revolutions as governments are being overthrown or new ideas are introduced to different governments. Things get violent, things get angry. People leave that environment, kind of like Mr. Shaw was talking about, to come to a place that's safer, America. And in the U.S., jobs and land are plentiful, supposedly, with new factories and new industries popping up all over the place in the late 1800s. You need people to work in them. Right.
They actually sent people over to Europe to basically job recruit and recruit people to come over to America. They needed people to work so badly. All right, so this one is just kind of a graphic showing you how immigration has increased really through for the last almost 200 years. Just want to point out to you that the immigrants from Europe were far, far greater from 1820, all the way to 1920 and even 1970. However, there's been a big shift in immigrants from Latin America and South America, and that's what this blue area is here. You see for the last 50 years, and this has not changed even though this says 2010. Even in 2020, it's still the same, that the majority of immigrants that are coming to this country are now from Latin America and South America. Another quick graphic for you. And I'll show you, we've got a couple things that happen here. This is just kind of showing you the change over time from 1846 all the way to 1924. You see immigration is really low here. And then once industrialization starts here towards, sorry, this thing keeps popping up, towards the 1870s, 1880s, then you're going to start see like more immigrants come over. And then so this is like where kind of the Transcontinental Railroad was finished. Then in the 1880s, we see the Chinese Exclusion Act, which again is specific to just people from China. They did again. A lot of people came to work on the railroad. A lot of Chinese people came to work on the railroad, uh, and this was kind of worrisome for Americans and even some newer immigrants because they were worried that Chinese people would take their jobs, and they wouldn't have as many opportunities for themselves.
They were willing to work for significantly less than Americans, specifically white Americans, and your European immigrants.
And we'll get to
all that, but there's more on the
bit.
Chinese Exclusion Act that we'll get to.
And then this is a picture of Ellis Island. Again, that is going to kind of open up in the 1890s, and that will really explode immigration all the way until you see here towards the end of like the 1915 area, where they start saying like, hey, we might need to like start limiting the number of immigrants that are coming into the country. And just one more note on that, like
Yeah,
I really love the idea of like, America is a country of immigrants, and that's what it always happens though is like really every nation is kind of a nation of immigrants, and then once they like kind of get set and they like get established, then former immigrants don't really like new immigrants anymore. Like it's like, hey, we have what we need, and we don't really want you to be taking that from us. And we'll talk about nativism here in just a second as well.
yeah. And on that, like they say that like the Irish built New York City because there was a high population of Irish immigrants that worked in like the steel industry and building those skyscrapers and things like that. So you might hear that sometimes, and that's just an example of immigrants coming in, kind of not taking over an industry, but being the workforce behind an industry, and then there not being jobs for your white lower middle class Americans. Again, we'll talk about that being a problem later. So the journey over here was not easy for immigrants, no matter where they're coming from, and it's not always easy today either. To come from Europe, it was a 1 week journey on a ship, 3 weeks from Asia. They were kind of crammed down below deck for the most part, and in really tight conditions. So disease spreads quickly because when you're all crammed in a tight space, you're breathing on each other. There's unsanitary conditions, things like that. No fresh air. And when you arrive in America, you arrive in the Atlantic, Ellis Island, outside of New York City, or in the Pacific, Angel Island, outside of San Francisco.
And just some pictures here of the conditions. You see
Yeah.
how tightly they're packed into the ships. Oh, there you go.
Okay.
So the life in the new land for immigrants, what you need to understand is that it's going to be difficult because you essentially come with nothing. Like most of the people coming over just came with the clothes on their backs, maybe a few extra things, but not a whole lot of money. And it was just like, hey, you got to hit the ground running, get to work.
And the journey over is really expensive, so you already didn't have a lot to begin with. That's why you're being pushed out of your country, right? Your push factor. You're going to spend whatever you got to get over here.
And so what you're going to see is that these people are going to really start banding together in order to survive. So they're going to find people who share their culture, religion, their language. They're going to create these ethnic neighborhoods with restaurants, newspapers. You hear about things like Chinatown. That was because there was a large group of Asian Americans that came there, or from China rather, and started. They all lived around the same area. They started restaurants around the same area. That's what they did to survive. What you're going to see, as I mentioned earlier, is the rise of what's called nativism. Now, we are a country of immigrants, but the immigrants that are coming in, they don't really want to take, they don't want to lose who they are. We're going to talk about assimilation with Native Americans as well, but assimilation is basically white Americans wanted these immigrants to kind of become American. They wanted them to be more like them. They wanted them to like, own land, work in a factory, whatever. They wanted to speak them to speak English.
And to be clear, you assimilate anywhere you go. Like if I move to France and I start while I live there eating French food and I learn the French language while I live there, that's assimilation. It's not always a negative thing, and sometimes it happens somewhat naturally. Uh, what we see though during this time is immigrants coming. They form these neighborhoods where they speak only the language from their homeland. They eat only that food. Their schools teach their children things from their homeland, and so they're not even assimilating to American culture. And so nativists from America that live here, people that nativism is people that are born here, right, that live here, um, they get upset about that. They're like, well, if you're going to come to America, be American. And so then we see that debate between nativism versus like assimilating, not assimilating, things like that.
You can even still see it today. Honestly,
Absolutely.
like my stepmother, for example, like wonderful woman, love her to death. But like when my parents-in-law speak to themselves, they usually speak in Spanish. And like she has said to me, like if they're in public, they should be speaking English. Like they're in this country, like we speak English, and it's like okay, but I mean, that, and they're much more comfortable with each other
Mm-hmm.
speaking Spanish and things like that, and it really doesn't hurt anybody. So it's these kind of things. They're still like remnants, I guess,
Yeah.
maybe. Anyway, nativism in general is overtly favoring native-born Americans or older immigrants. And they are going to these people, these older immigrants, these native-born Americans are going to be in favor of immigration restrictions, and this kind of leads us to Americanization, which is an organized effort to help these immigrants to assimilate. They teach them, language, English, civic duty, social etiquette, because again, where you're in a whole new country and you don't necessarily know those things right away. So there's just a lot of different things going on that you need to know. All you really need to understand is that life is going to be very difficult, and assimilating is going to be very difficult, but even more so to be successful.
Yes, and to be clear, Americanization is sometimes harmless, but sometimes it wasn't on the choice of the immigrant to be Americanized, if that makes sense. It was more forced assimilation in some cases, whereas assimilation kind of can happen naturally. Americanization was not set up to happen naturally. It's more forced, whether that's positive force or negative force. Um,
Like you're going to dress like us, you're going
yeah,
to speak like us,
whether you want that or not, like
right.
it doesn't just happen naturally. It doesn't just evolve.
It's a good way to look at it. I
Chinese
can,
exclusion act. Do you want this?
I can take this
You want
one.
this one?
So the reason that I brought it up earlier was like the part of the reason why the Chinese were such an interesting or they had such an interesting dynamic in America is because they were the first immigrants that did not look like the immigrants that had always been here.
It's easy to pick them out in a crowd.
Right. Like if you're an Irish immigrant, you're white still.
Blend
You
in.
can blend in a lot easier, but the Chinese definitely struggled with that, obviously. So this is an immigration law passed in 1882, and it would prevent Chinese laborers from immigrating to the United States. Again, because of like nativists were worried about losing their jobs, as Ms. Willbrand said, because the Chinese were usually willing to work for much less than Americans. This is going to exclude Chinese nationals from United States citizenship, and in 1924 it prevented citizens of other Asian nations from immigrating to the United States, and it was in effect until 1943, which is shocking. That should shock you that for
Yeah.
60 years, Chinese and then eventually pretty much all of Asia were really not allowed to immigrate to this country. Uh, that is going to be most immigrants in general. Like Miss Wilbur and I were kind of talking about this earlier. Like most immigrants are going to be really hardworking people. Like if you want to leave your country, that is a very difficult thing to do. Like if you are willing to make that risk, take that risk, make that sacrifice, you're probably going to be somebody that this country can benefit from your hard work, your work ethic, and things like that. So just banning a whole race just because of their race, essentially, is really, really dangerous. And I think that America probably lost out on a lot of positive aspects of Chinese culture and just having more diversity in general. However, diversity was not a really big concern
Not really your
back
goal.
in back in back in the
Profits are
day.
your goal. All right, so there are some problems for farmers as well. Farmers are going to unite to address common problems that they are facing. So farmers are going to buy more land to grow more crops to pay off debts. Debtors are going to have to pay loans in dollars worth more than those borrowed, and prices of crops are going to fall dramatically. If prices of crops fall, then you can't pay your bills as a farmer. So farming is one of those things where you have to pay all the money up front in order to do your job, and then you just hope for a good reward in the end, which is why like flooding and things like that even today are so detrimental to farmers, because you pay for the seed, you pay for the land, you pay for the tractor, you pay for the transportation, you pay for it all, and then just hope it all grows, and then you can yield a profit off of that. And so when prices of crops fall dramatically at the end of the season, there's harvest, they can't pay off their loans. The farmers also face problems with the railroads because there's a lack of competition in railroads, as you saw in the other video when we were talking about transcontinental railroad. There are tons of railroads, clusters of them in the north and in the east, but as you move westward, they get more sparse. And because of that, a lot of times there's only one rail line to transport your crops on. You need the railroad to transport your crops. There's no other way to get it out of your town. And if you can't get it out of the town, then you can't sell it. Everyone around you grows the same crop. We talked about specializing in certain areas, right? Because of the lack of competitions, railroads can charge whatever they want to move your crop. So on top of not being able to pay anything after a not so good, because the price of crops falls, now you also can't even pay to transport your crop to sell it. So now you can't make any money off of it at all. And so we see farmers losing their land and going bankrupt solely because the government is not putting any kind of restrictions on railroad pricing and because they have overborrowed and can't pay their loans.
Perfect. So this is going to lead to what's known as the Populist Party. This is another example of farmers banding together, a lot like what you saw with labor unions, not quite the same. They're going to form their own political party, and they're going to actually run candidates for president. When they're not successful with the presidency, however, a lot of populist party members really do win a lot of local elections, even state elections. So they really make a really big movement, across the country to try to help farmers and really poor people in general. So the populism in general is a movement of the people. The Populist Party wants change, and we're going to talk a lot about that next unit. But this is just kind of an intro to that. So an economic reform they wanted to increase the money supply. They wanted a graduated income tax, which means that the more money you make, the more income tax you pay. And then they also wanted federal loans, which are going to be protected by the federal government and not just like a private loan from a private bank. Also, increasing the money supply helps farmers because they have more money when they go to pay back their loans. And it's really confusing. I'm not going to get into it now, but it's a good thing for people that owe money when there's more money in the supply. For political motivation or political changes, they wanted the Senate to be elected by popular vote. We'll talk about that more later. They also wanted a secret ballot. They did not want people to know who you voted for, so they couldn't like threaten you to vote for a certain person. And they also wanted an 8-hour workday. Man, just a bunch of lazy people here. What is that like? Anyway, in 1892, the populist candidates elected at different levels of government. However, the Democratic Party eventually is going to adopt the platform. So the Populist Party really doesn't need to exist anymore because the Democrats kind of stole it, unfortunately.
But the Populist Party is a really great example of people banding together and using the government and the ability to run for office and organize to their advantage to get things accomplished.
Perfect.
All right, Native Americans. So the government does restrict Native Americans in many, many different ways. So Native American land cannot be owned, but settlers want to own that land. Settlers think that natives forfeited the land because they did not improve it in any way. They're not mass producing farms. They're not opening factories. They're not doing anything to improve the quality of the land or society as a whole. According to the white American settlers, right? With me? Since they consider the land unsettled because whites aren't farming it, migrants go west to claim that land. In 1834, the government designates the Great Plains as one huge reservation for the Native Americans. And in the 1850s, there are a bunch of treaties signed to define specific boundaries for each tribe. This is a problem because some tribes are semi-nomadic because they follow their food source, which in a lot of cases out in the plains are the buffalo. But we also see people killing all of the buffalo, and a lot of times for fun, we see people shooting buffalo from moving trains without collecting the buffalo, using the meat, using all the bones and the hide like the Native Americans do. They just kill them for fun. And that takes the food and the resources away from the Native Americans. And so when you confine them to an area and also take away the things that they need, they are not going to thrive as a culture and as a society, right? Because of this, we're going to see a whole bunch of bloody battles and interactions between whites and natives ensue. We see that through westward expansion. We see it through the gold rush. We have seen it since the beginning of colonization. It doesn't change. It just gets more and more violent as white Americans move westward.
And we don't talk about manifest destiny as much anymore, but that was kind of the idea that, you know, white Americans were supposed to own all of the land from the Atlantic to the Pacific Ocean, and they were going to do whatever it took to get that. So, and it's really sad. Again, we don't have time to go more into it, but it's a really sad history, but one that is we're kind of seeing more rights. We saw more rights. We'll talk about it in the 1960s and 70s, but we're getting ahead of ourselves. Finishing up Native Americans, the government, as I mentioned earlier, is going to support assimilation. We want them to, the United States government and white Americans want them to abandon their traditions. They want like Native Americans to live like white Americans, and you can kind of see here. This is a picture of this same young man, okay, like as a Native American in his traditional like dress, and then as in American, like fully Americanized here.
He did not want that. I would assume.
I would assume that you're correct. A lot of them Native Americans were forced to go to what's called the Carlisle School for Boys, which had its own crazy set of scandals and things that happened there. But basically, they were forced to learn English. They were forced to abandon their traditional cultures. I mean, basically,
their appearance, cut their hair.
Exactly. They had to basically change their entire way of life and join white culture, or they were really not accepted into white culture.
And this poses two problems. One, you're forcing people to change who they are and where they're from. And two, because they took the children away from the reservations to put them into these schools, and the Carlisle School for Boys isn't the only school that opens, there are a few throughout the nation. But because you take such a young generation away from their families, put them in these boarding schools, change who they are, they don't learn the Native American cultures or traditions. And unfortunately, Native American culture and tradition is passed down generation to generation. When you remove a generation and then they go back, some of them did go back, most of them did not, and they go back, they don't know all the tradition and the culture, the things that they do, and so it's lost forever.
Well, and that was probably a targeted move by the U.S. government to basically break the cycle. Anyway, Ms. Willbrand talked about the destruction of the buffalo earlier.
Oh, sorry.
You're fine. What you need to know is that this all ended, all these bloody battles and this fight for assimilation and Americanization ended with the Battle of Wounded Knee. There was a ritual that was started called the Ghost Dance Movement, and it was basically a ritual to regain the lost Native American lands. Native Americans believed that if they did this dance, that they would eventually gain their lost land back. And it didn't end well. The Battle of Wounded Knee, basically, U.S. cavalry killed 300 unarmed Native Americans. A lot of them were women and children. And basically, that was it. After Wounded Knee, the Native Americans, they kind of gave up fighting. They went to reservations, and they did not thrive after that either.
And to this day, we still see a lot of struggles in Native American culture on the reservations that we can talk more about in class. Yep. All right, African Americans, we do see legal discrimination toward African Americans for at least 10 years after Reconstruction. Southern blacks can vote, but that's going to be I mean, we're going to talk about poll taxes and things like that as we move through. During the lowest point, southern states do enact laws to weaken African American political powers. So, like, you have to take tests to be able to vote. You have to pay taxes to be able to vote. There are different things that you need to do in order to be able to participate in um, our democratic system, uh, which they should be able to do, but because of these actions, they're not allowed to. Some of those voting restrictions by 1900, all southern states restrict voting. They deny equality. Some limit the vote to those who can read. They give literacy tests. We see the poll tax, which is a tax that you have to pay in order to go vote. And then in some places we see the grandfather clause, which is basically a clause that says, like, if your grandfather was a slave, or if your grandfather could not vote, then you can't either. We still hear the grandfather clause term used in a lot of things, especially in business. Like, I know I say all the time, we have like a really old AT&T plan, and it's cheap, and I refuse to change it because it's cheap. We are grandfathered into that plan, like they don't offer it anymore. So when you hear that phrase, this is the unfortunate part of history that it comes from, if that makes sense.
What you guys need to understand about this is that the main way that African Americans could change their way of life, they could change their situation, was by voting for people who were going to fight for them in government and Congress. And the main way for white Americans to maintain their way of life, like meaning slavery, even though slavery was outlawed, was by restricting African Americans from voting. And uh, and so because of these restrictions, African Americans are really not going to be able to get out of this position until the 1960s and even into the 1980s. And honestly, this fight still continues today. And we'll talk a lot more about that in class, though. The last thing you need to know about this is Jim Crow laws. So the first is kind of an extension, almost like an organized name for all of the things that African Americans were having to deal with during the time. So in the 1870s, 1880s, the Supreme Court allows the poll tax and the grandfather clause. And what they start doing is they start doing racial segregation, which is just basically the separation based on race. So whites are going to live here, blacks are going to live here. But and then they take it one step further with these Jim Crow laws, and they start by separating everything. Start separating schools. There's going to be a white school and a black school. There's going to be separate water fountains. There's going to be separate theaters, separate restaurants, everything. And this leads to Plessy versus Ferguson, which is a Supreme Court case in 1896, which essentially legalizes this segregation. It says that segregation is legal or constitutional as long as the separate facilities are equal. And what we find is that nobody really followed that. They decided that they were going to still separate everything. However, the equal part is really more kind of subjective. Uh, hey, you have it, therefore it is equal, but they wouldn't cost the same amount of money. They wouldn't really keep up things like the schools, especially, were horrendous. They were using books that were, decades old or falling apart.
But both schools had books, therefore they're equal. You see
Right.
the loopholes that we're
Right.
talking about?
We'll talk about this a lot more in class, but we wanted to kind of get you started with that. And hey, look at that.
We
Under
did it.
under 30 minutes.
We did it.
We're the best. See you guys next time.
Bye.